Max's paws padded softly on the concrete, his sharp eyes scanning the crowded square ahead. The busy morning rush of the city seemed ordinary. People walking briskly to work, kids on their way to school, vendors shouting over the noise of the bustling marketplace. It was just another day, one filled with the usual noise and chaos. But Max wasn't fooled. He had been trained to sense things most people couldn't, things hidden under the normal layers of life. And today, something wasn't right. His handler, Sergeant Eric Cole, stood beside him, watching the same crowd with a practiced eye. Max could feel his partner's presence, steady and calm, unlike the tense energy pulsing through the air. The two of them had been working together for 5 years, and Eric had taught Max everything he needed to know. They were a team. Eric's hand tightened on the leash, a signal Max had learned to pay attention to. They were on a routine patrol today, a security check at a crowded public event, but something felt off. Max's nostrils flared as he took in the scents of the morning air, the aroma of fresh coffee from the corner cafe, the warm scent of street food wafting through the air. But there was something more, something faint but growing stronger. The unmistakable scent of explosives. Max's tail stiffened, his nose twitching as he moved forward, pulling gently on the leash. Eric, reading the dog's reaction, immediately stepped into alert mode. "Max, find," Eric commanded in a low, calm voice. Max obeyed without hesitation, his sharp instincts guiding him to a group of large crates near a shipping truck. People milled about, unaware of the danger lurking just out of sight, too absorbed in their routines to notice the scent of death growing stronger by the second. Max slowed, circling the crates, his nose pressed to the cold metal. He could feel the weight of the explosives inside, buried deep within the containers. The ticking of the timer was faint, but undeniable. Time was running out. Eric moved closer, taking slow steps as he kept his eyes on the crowd. His heart began to race as he recognized the telltale signs of a bomb threat. The crates, the truck, the nervous energy surrounding the area, it all pointed to something sinister. He knelt down to Max's level, his voice barely a whisper. "Good boy, Max. You've got it. We need to call it in." Max stayed alert, his eyes never leaving the crates, his body tense. "Sergeant Cole? Max." The voice came from behind, urgent and high-pitched. Eric whipped around to see a colleague rushing toward him, face pale with panic. "What's wrong, Harris?" Eric barked, his eyes never leaving the bomb. "You need to evacuate the area now," Harris shouted, waving his arms frantically. "There's a secondary device. It's already been triggered." Eric's blood ran cold. The sound of sirens echoed in the distance as Max growled softly, his muscles recoiling, ready for action. They couldn't wait for evacuation orders, couldn't risk losing precious seconds. "Call it in," Eric ordered. "Tell them we've got a bomb, and we need the bomb squad now." Before Harris could respond, the ground shook. It was like a punch to the gut, the sudden jolt of the explosion throwing Eric to the ground. Max immediately leapt on top of him, shielding him from the debris as the world seemed to explode in chaos. Screams filled the air as glass shattered, and the distant wail of the sirens grew louder. Panic spread like wildfire, and people scattered in every direction, desperately trying to flee. Max stood protectively over Eric, barking frantically as he looked for the source of the blast. Dust and smoke filled the air, obscuring their vision. The world around them had become a blur of confusion, shouts, and the frantic sound of people scrambling to safety. Eric struggled to his feet, blood trickling down his face from a cut on his forehead. He grabbed Max's collar, pulling the dog. Close as the panic intensified. "Stay with me, boy," Eric muttered through clenched teeth. The air was thick with smoke, and Eric could barely hear himself think, "We've got to find that second bomb." Max's ears were perked, his eyes scanning the chaos. He could still sense the second device, its presence burning in the back of his mind. The scent of explosives was overwhelming now, a thick, suffocating smell that made the air feel heavier, dangerous. Max pulled on the leash, eager to keep moving. Eric stumbled, his vision swimming as he tried to regain his bearings. He couldn't hear anything over the noise of the bomb's aftermath, shouting, car alarms blaring, and the distant wail of sirens, but he could feel the urgency in Max's movements. "Find it, Max," Eric barked. His voice was hoarse, panicked. Max lunged forward, nose to the ground, tail rigid, leading Eric toward a construction site across the street. The workers had already scattered, abandoning their tools and equipment in a hurry. Max's nose twitched, and he darted toward a pile of crates. He stopped abruptly, his body rigid. Eric took one look at the pile of discarded materials before he realized the danger. His stomach twisted with dread. The bomb wasn't far. It was right there, buried under debris. "We need to clear the area," Eric shouted, his voice hoarse. "Harris, get back! It's too close!" But Harris was already moving, his voice lost in the noise. The seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity. Max barked once, then turned back to look at Eric, his eyes meeting his handlers with a silent understanding. He'd found the bomb. They had no time left. Eric's heart pounded as he pulled his radio from his vest, his hands shaking. "This is Sergeant Cole. We've found the secondary device. I need immediate backup, now!" There was a long pause before the voice on the other end responded. "Copy that, Sergeant. Evacuation is underway. We've got units on the way." Eric didn't wait. He knew that time wasn't on their side. "Max, stay," Eric ordered. "Stay with the bomb. Don't move, buddy." Max didn't hesitate, sitting beside the crate and staring up at Eric, his eyes unwavering. Eric took one step back, two. The air felt thick, suffocating with tension. Max was still at his post, his focus unyielding, even as the storm of chaos continued around them. Eric's chest tightened. He could hear the sound of the approaching backup, but something wasn't right. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and then, just as the backup team arrived, the second explosion detonated. The world had shifted on its axis. The second explosion ripped through the city, a deafening roar that sent shockwaves across the square. Max, still near the bomb, instinctively dove toward his handler, trying to shield Eric from the blast. But the force was overwhelming. The ground buckled beneath them as debris rained down from above, the sky darkening with the smoke of the explosion. Time seemed to stretch and warp as the world around them became a blur of fire, shattered glass, and chaos. When the dust finally began to settle, everything felt unreal. The sounds of the sirens, the screams, the panic, it all echoed in Eric's head like a distant nightmare. Eric's body was heavy, his head pounded with a dull throb. His arms were locked around Max, his loyal German shepherd, who was lying on top of him, still as a rock. Max's breath came in short, labored pants as Eric's heart raced, and for a moment he couldn't move. His body was stiff, frozen in place by the shock of what had just happened. Max shifted slightly, his nose nudging Eric's hand. The dog was alive. That was all that mattered. "Max," Eric croaked, his voice barely audible. He tried to sit up, but the pain in his side made him wince. His left leg felt like it was on fire, and his head swam with dizziness. Max nudged him again, whimpering softly. Eric's hand found the dog's collar, and for a moment they just stayed there, breathing in the aftermath of the explosion. The sounds of destruction had muted, but the chaos was far from over. The city was still in a state of panic, and there was no guarantee that more bombs hadn't been planted. Eric's mind raced. His first priority was Max, his partner, and then the civilians who had been caught in the blast. He tried to push himself up again, this time forcing his body to obey. The pain was excruciating, but he had no choice. The pain wasn't the worst of it, though. The worst of it was the knowledge that he hadn't seen his team, his squad, his men. "Cole!" a voice screamed from the distance. It was barely recognizable over the crackling chaos, but Eric recognized it as Harris. He looked around, trying to focus, but everything was spinning. "Cole, you alive?" Harris's voice reached him again, this time closer. There was no mistaking the urgency in his tone. Eric blinked rapidly, trying to clear his vision. "Yeah, I'm here," he called back hoarsely. "Max is fine." But there was no time to check on the dog's wounds. The explosion had done more than just tear through the crowd. Eric's thoughts turned immediately to his team, the ones he hadn't seen in the rush of the evacuation, the team members that he had trained alongside, the ones he had come to trust with his life. They had been part of this mission, part of this operation. Where were they? "Eric!" Harris appeared, covered in dust but alive. His face was tight with stress. "The bomb. It didn't just take out the square. There's another blast. The second device was a decoy. They set a timer for a third explosion inside the building." He paused, catching his breath. "Cole, where are the others?" Eric clenched his jaw. The panic in Harris's eyes was clear. The threat was far from over. Max whined and tugged at his leash, pulling Eric's attention back to the present. The dog was trying to lead him, a sharp whine filling the air. "Stay with me, buddy," Eric said, gritting his teeth through the pain. He forced himself to stand, ignoring the searing ache in his leg. "We need to find the others." Max growled low in his throat, but he didn't move forward. His eyes were trained on something off to the side. "Max?" Eric's voice softened, concern slipping in. The dog's nostrils flared, his body tense as he stood at attention. The bark that erupted from him was sharp, piercing. Eric's heart raced. Max never reacted like this, unless he sensed something far worse. "What is it, boy?" Max turned sharply. His body locked onto a distant figure standing amidst the ruins, a figure that moved with the purposeful calm of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The person was dressed in black, with a mask covering their face. Blending into the shadows of the wreckage, a terrorist. Eric didn't hesitate. He grabbed his radio and shoved it into Harris's hands. "Call for backup," he ordered, his voice firm despite the fear gnawing at him. "I'm going after him." "Cole, wait!" Harris shouted, but Eric was already moving. Max bounded ahead, following the figure with a determined pace. Eric limped behind, the pain in his leg a constant reminder that time was against them. But there was no choice. The terrorist was out there, and he couldn't let him escape. The figure darted down an alleyway, disappearing into the shadows. Eric pushed himself harder, ignoring the burning in his legs, and followed Max's lead. The dog's body was a blur. As he moved through the debris, the rhythm of his steps steady, unwavering. They reached the alley, and Eric paused at the entrance. The figure was still ahead, now walking at a much slower pace, almost as if taunting them. "Stop!" Eric shouted, his voice hoarse, but the figure didn't slow down. Instead, it turned its head just slightly, as if acknowledging their presence before vanishing deeper into the maze of abandoned buildings. Max growled again, more ferocious this time, his teeth bared as he prepared to chase. Eric took a steadying breath and followed suit, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't afford to think of the danger. He couldn't afford to think about what might happen to him or Max. He only had one priority: stopping the threat. The terrorist had to be caught before they could escape, before they could claim. More lives. They turned a corner. And then Eric saw it, the faint glint of metal tucked away in the shadows, something that shouldn't have been there. The bomb. Eric's heart dropped. He didn't have time to think. His training kicked in, and his mind flashed through every possibility. The timer on the bomb was ticking down, but there was no time to call for help. Max barked, pulling away from Eric and charging forward. "No!" Eric shouted, his voice breaking as he pushed forward. "Max!" But it was too late. Eric's heart raced in his chest as Max lunged toward the bomb, his paws skidding on the dirt-streaked pavement. The dog's fur was a blur of movement, a force of nature as he tore across the alley. Eric couldn't keep up. His legs burned with the effort, and pain shot through his injured side. But he had no choice. He couldn't let Max reach the bomb alone. "Max!" Eric yelled, but the dog was already too far ahead, his senses locked onto the deadly device. Max stopped a few feet from the bomb, his body tense as he sat down in front of it, his gaze unwavering. His nose twitched, the scent of explosives heavy in the air, the timer ticking down relentlessly. Eric's heart hammered in his chest as he stumbled toward the dog, sweat pouring down his face despite the freezing temperature. It was a countdown. And they didn't have much time. Eric dropped to his knees beside Max, his hand trembling as he reached for his radio, cursing under his breath as he fumbled for the right frequency. His mind raced, trying to calculate the seconds. How much time did they have left? "Cole, come in!" Harris's voice crackled through the static. "I need backup now," Eric managed to say through clenched teeth. His voice was tight with panic. "Max has located the bomb. I'm not sure how much time we have, but it's ticking down." "Roger that," Harris replied quickly. "We're on our way. Hold tight, hold tight!" Easier said than done. Eric could feel the sweat beginning to freeze on his skin as the tension in the air thickened. He glanced at Max, who remained perfectly still, his focus sharp. The dog was more than just a companion. He was the key to stopping this disaster. If anyone could locate and disarm the bomb, it was Max. But Eric wasn't a bomb expert. He didn't have the knowledge to defuse it. He was a soldier, not a technician. "Max," Eric said, his voice softening, "can you help me, buddy?" Max's ears perked up at his voice, his gaze flicking briefly toward Eric. It was a subtle change, but it was enough to remind Eric of the bond they shared. Max wasn't just a trained dog. He was a partner, a protector, a part of Eric's team. Eric reached into his vest, grabbing his multi-tool and carefully prying at the outer casing of the bomb. His hands were shaking. Every second felt like an eternity. The world around them seemed to stand still as the seconds ticked down. The sound of boots crunching on gravel echoed through the alley, and Eric's breath caught in his throat. Harris and the backup squad had arrived. "We're here," Harris shouted, sprinting toward them with 2 other soldiers in tow. "We've got the bomb squad on the way, Cole. Get clear." Eric didn't answer. He couldn't afford to. The bomb was too close, and there was no time to waste. He kept his eyes focused on the device, studying the wires, the casing, the faint glow of the timer counting down. Max growled low in his throat, a warning sound that echoed through the narrow alley. The dog was still focused, still watching the device with an intensity that made Eric's heart swell with pride. "We need to disarm it now," Eric said, his voice low but firm. "It's too close. If we don't act fast, this entire block will be gone." The bomb squad was still several minutes away, and Eric knew that every second they waited would cost them. Max's instincts had led them to this point, and now it was up to Eric to make sure they didn't waste any more time. Eric motioned to Harris, who had pulled out a first aid kit and was crouching by the side, ready to help if necessary. "Get ready to move," Eric ordered. "If this goes off, we need to get out of here fast. Harris, get those civilians away from the blast zone." But Harris didn't respond. Instead, the other soldiers had fallen silent, their eyes wide as they stared at Max. "What's wrong?" Eric asked, turning toward them. We can't just pull the wires, Sergeant," one of the soldiers said, his voice tense. "This looks like a complex device. We need to know which wire to cut." Max growled again, more insistently. This time, his body coiled as though he could feel the tension building in the air. Eric cursed under his breath, his mind racing. They didn't have the luxury of time. The bomb squad would take too long to arrive. The threat was right in front of them, and it was ticking down faster than they could act. "Max," Eric said softly, his hand reaching out to the dog's collar. He looked into Max's eyes, silently pleading with him. "We don't have much time, buddy. I need you to help me." Max's tail twitched slightly as he looked back at Eric, a subtle but undeniable sign of acknowledgement. Eric took a deep breath and focused. The world around him seemed to fade away. There was nothing but him, Max, and the bomb. The seconds continued to slip away, one by one. "I'll try the red wire," Eric muttered under his breath. "Max, stay!" He carefully reached for the wire and in one swift motion snipped it with his multi-tool. The sound of the timer clicking abruptly stopped. Silence. Max's ears perked up as he took a step back, his head tilted, waiting for the explosion, but nothing came. Eric's heart was in his throat. Had he done it? Did it work? Harris asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Eric looked up at the squad, and for a moment the world held its breath. Max's ears flattened to his head as he let out a low, satisfied bark. The danger was over. "Thank God," Eric breathed, slumping with relief. His entire body felt like jelly, his limbs shaking with adrenaline. "We did it." But they weren't out of the woods yet. The explosion had been stopped, but the devastation was far from over. The city had been rocked to its core, and the terrorist threat was still out there. "Max, good boy," Eric said, his voice thick with emotion. He patted the dog's head, his fingers trembling. "You saved us, buddy." Max nudged him with his nose, his tail wagging slightly. The bond between them was unspoken, but it was more powerful than anything words could express. The backup team quickly moved in, securing the area and preparing to search for any remaining threats. Eric looked around at the devastation. The job was far from over, but he knew one thing for sure. As long as Max was by his side, they could face anything. They'd survived the blast. They'd stopped the attack, and they'd done it together. The city was safe for now, but Eric knew there were still more dangers ahead. But whatever came next, Max would be there. They were a team, and together they were unstoppable. The city was alive with the hum of recovery efforts. The smoke from the explosion still hung in the air, mingling with the sound of sirens, the chatter of emergency personnel, and the pounding footsteps of soldiers moving swiftly through the wreckage. The immediate danger had been neutralized, but the aftermath had only just begun, and Eric knew the hardest part was yet to come. Max was by his side, ever vigilant, his senses still on high alert. Despite the bomb's defusal, Eric could feel the tension in the air. The blast had been too calculated. The bombs, 2 decoys, and a third explosive designed to take out the emergency responders, were meant to paralyze the city, to strike, terror at its core. But whoever had orchestrated it wasn't finished. This was just the beginning. "We need to find out who's behind this," Eric muttered, his gaze scanning the horizon. He had no idea where the rest of his team was, but they needed to regroup, and they needed answers. "Sergeant Cole," Harris called from behind, his voice steady but filled with concern. "The bomb squad's cleared out the area. We've got people starting to get the injured to medical tents, but—" Eric turned to face Harris, who was holding a folder. His face was grave. "We've got a lead," Harris continued. "There's been chatter. Intelligence suggests another strike, but we're not sure where or when." Eric's chest tightened. Another strike. He didn't want to think about it, but he had to. The terrorist attack on the square had been expertly executed, with no obvious signs of who was behind it. It was a calculated hit, clean, cold, and strategic. "Where's our next target?" Eric asked, his tone unwavering. Harris hesitated for a fraction of a second. "We don't know yet, but there's something strange. The bombs were sophisticated, but they're connected to a shadow group, one we haven't seen in years." Eric frowned. He didn't like the sound of that. This wasn't just some random act of terrorism, it was something far worse. "A shadow group?" Eric asked, his voice hardening. "Who are they?" "It's the Ghost Cell," Harris said, the words sounding more like a curse than a name. "An underground organization known for its covert operations. They've been silent for almost a decade, but they've been linked to some of the most brutal attacks in history." Eric's mind reeled. The Ghost Cell was notorious. Their operations were legendary for their secrecy, their ability to strike with precision and disappear without a trace. They were one of the most dangerous organizations in the world, and they never left survivors. But now they were back. "I thought they were wiped out," Eric muttered, more to himself than to Harris. "How are they back?" Harris shook his head, his jaw clenched. "No one knows, but whoever's behind this, they've been planning this for months, maybe even longer." Eric's mind whirled with the implications. If the ghost cell was behind the attack, they weren't just after one city. They were after something much bigger, something more dangerous. Max, sensing Eric's frustration, nudged his hand with his nose. The dog's eyes were filled with quiet, understanding, as though he knew the gravity of the situation. Eric patted Max's head. "You're right, buddy," he said softly. "We need to focus. We'll get through this. Together." The two men stood there in silence for a moment, taking in the aftermath. The once bustling square had become a chaotic disaster zone, filled with smoke, rubble, and broken glass. Emergency crews were working tirelessly to sift through the debris, searching for survivors. But Eric knew the truth. Some of the people caught in the explosion wouldn't make it. "We need to get our people together," Eric said, his voice a little firmer now. "We need to mobilize before they can strike again." Harris nodded, but there was an unreadable look in his eyes. He seemed uncertain, his hands clutching the folder tighter, as if it weighed more than just the paper it was made of. "I'll get on it, Sergeant," Harris said, but as he walked away, Eric could see the way his back was hunched, the way his movement seemed a little slower. Harris wasn't as confident as he appeared, and that made Eric uneasy. This mission was taking its toll on everyone. Eric turned to Max. "Let's go, boy. We've got work to do." The dog barked once, his tail wagging, and the two of them moved out toward the command post, where the city's leadership was meeting to coordinate the recovery and response efforts. They had to find answers, and they had to find them fast. The command post was a busy hub of activity, filled with officers, medical personnel, and military representatives. The room was dim, lit only by the cold glow of monitors tracking the city's security feeds and radio communication systems. The weight of the situation was thick in the air, and as Eric entered, the room fell quiet. "We've got a problem," Eric said, cutting through the tension. He glanced at the gathered group. "The ghost cell is back. They're behind the bombing." A murmur rippled through the room, and Eric could feel the collective weight of the realization. The ghost cell was a name that struck fear in the hearts of even the most seasoned soldiers. Their operations had been shrouded in secrecy, with no warning signs. They could be anywhere, in any form. And now they were targeting the city. Eric set his jaw, his gaze sweeping across the room. "We don't have time to waste. We need to secure the city and track down every lead. We can't afford to let them strike again." "Roger that," one of the commanders said, nodding firmly. "We'll get teams out on the ground, but we need your expertise, Sergeant. You've dealt with them before." Eric's breath caught. The ghost cell wasn't a name he ever wanted to hear again. He'd fought them once before in the field, a brutal operation that left scars on him, both physically and mentally. But he'd been a part of a bigger team then. Now it was just him and Max. "I'm in," Eric said, his voice unwavering. "But we need to move fast. We're running out of time." He turned to Max, who was sitting at attention, his eyes scanning the room. Eric smiled faintly, despite the heavy weight pressing on his chest. "Let's finish this, boy." The city felt like a war zone. Even as the streets were slowly cleared and emergency services worked tirelessly to help those affected, the undercurrent of fear was palpable. People walked with eyes wide, whispering to each other about what had happened, what might happen next. Every siren that echoed through the air sent a ripple of anxiety through the crowd. Eric's nerves were just as frayed as the city's. He couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was unfolding, something that no one was prepared before. The ghost cell had resurfaced, and they were playing a dangerous game. It wasn't just about bombs anymore. It was about control, chaos, fear, "Sergeant," Harris said, breaking Eric's thoughts. He was standing in the command post, his expression grim as he stared at the map spread out on the table. Several officers gathered around it, discussing their next move. Eric and Max entered, the dog's paws clicking against the tiled floor. Harris looked up, his face hard with determination. "We've got another lead, a potential target." Eric raised an eyebrow. "Where?" Harris pointed to the map. "A building near the city center. It's a high-profile location, one of the government's most important offices. It's supposed to be secure, but we've detected unusual activity around it." Eric's stomach churned. A government building? If the ghost cell was going after that, it wasn't just about striking fear into the people. It was about crippling the city's leadership. "We need to act fast," Eric said, his voice low but steady. "Harris, send in the best teams you've got. I'll take Max and head there now." "Sergeant," Harris started, but Eric held up a hand. "No time for arguments. We're not waiting for confirmation. We're not waiting for orders. We're going to stop them before it's too late." Max's ears perked up at his handler's words, as if the dog understood the urgency in the air. His body tensed, ready to move. Eric's heart swelled with pride. Max was always there, ready for whatever came next. "Understood," Harris said after a beat, his gaze flicking to the other officers in the room. "We'll mobilize teams. Good luck, Sergeant." The cold wind sliced through the air as Eric and Max made their way through the alleyways toward the target. The sky was darkening, the grey clouds swirling ominously overhead. The sense of unease was growing, thick and heavy like a storm about to break. Max trotted ahead, his nose twitching. As he sniffed the air, Eric's hand tightened on the strap of his vest, his instincts flaring. The closer they got to the building, the more the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He knew something was wrong. He could feel it in his bones. "I've got your back, boy," Eric muttered to Max, who glanced back at him with a quick wag of his tail. The dog was always calm, always in control, and it made Eric feel a little more steady, a little more confident. They arrived at the building's perimeter, crouching low in the shadows to observe. The area was heavily guarded, with a mix of police and military personnel stationed at various points around the complex. But Eric knew the ghost cell. They were experts at infiltration. Guards didn't guarantee safety. "Stay close, Max," Eric whispered. He checked his weapons and his gear, then scanned the building's structure for weaknesses. His eyes flicked to the windows, the doors, the security cameras. There were patterns, vulnerabilities in the system that could be exploited. He just needed to find the right moment. Max growled low in his throat, his body tense as he stared at a shadow in the distance. Eric followed his gaze and saw nothing out of the ordinary, just the stillness of the night. But Max knew something was off. The dog's instincts were never wrong. Suddenly a faint sound reached Eric's ears. A clicking noise, the sound of something small but metallic, and then a flash of movement from the shadows. "Ambush!" Eric shouted, instinctively grabbing Max's collar and pulling him to the ground. A volley of bullets tore through the air, narrowly missing them. The gunfire echoed off the surrounding buildings, sharp and deafening. Max growled again, his body shifting as he turned his head toward Eric, waiting for his command. Eric's mind worked quickly, processing everything. The ghost cell had anticipated their move. This wasn't just a bombing threat anymore. It was an all-out assault. "We need cover," Eric shouted, pulling Max along as they crawled toward a nearby stack of crates. The bullets continued to tear through the air, but they were closer now, dangerously so. The attackers had a clear line of sight, and they weren't pulling any punches. Max barked once, and Eric felt a jolt of adrenaline surge through him. The dog was ready to fight, to protect. Eric pulled out his sidearm, aiming carefully as he peered around the corner of the crates. His eyes scanned the darkness, looking for any sign of movement. The attackers were well trained, and they knew how to blend into the surroundings. But Eric wasn't afraid. With a quick glance to Max, Eric gave a short command. "Go!" Max surged forward, his body moving like a bullet through the night. He darted across the open space between the crates and the nearby streetlight, his form a blur as he moved with purpose. Eric followed closely behind, but he was always a step behind, relying on Max to lead the way. The moment they reached the streetlight, Max stopped. He tilted his head, listening, his ears swiveling as he sniffed the air. Eric crouched low, watching for any signs of movement. He could hear the faintest rustle of leaves, the soft crunch of gravel underfoot. And then, there it was. A shadow. A figure moving with deliberate purpose toward the building. Another member of the ghost cell. "Max, heel!" Eric barked. Without hesitation, the German shepherd darted forward, his body in a blur of motion as he pounced on the figure. The attacker barely had time to react before Max had him pinned to the ground, his sharp teeth bared. Eric was right behind him, taking the figure's weapon from their hand before the attacker could raise it. The struggle was brief, brutal. The attacker fought back, but Max had the upper hand. His training was precise, his movements calculated. Within moments, the enemy was disarmed and restrained. "Good boy," Eric breathed, his voice low with gratitude as he looked down at the subdued figure. Max's tail gave a single, approving wag. Eric turned back toward the building. The night wasn't over yet. There was still work to be done. The ghost cell was out there, and they weren't going to stop until they had what they wanted. But for now, at least, they'd made a small dent. And that was enough. The early morning fog rolled, in thick and heavy, settling over the city like a blanket. The pale light of the rising sun struggled to break through the clouds, casting a ghostly glow over the remnants of the previous night's chaos. The city was still reeling from the explosion, the gunfire, and the shock that followed. Yet, amidst the wreckage, there was something undeniable: hope. Eric and Max had spent the night tracking down leads, piecing together whatever information they could find. The ghost cell had made their move, but they hadn't anticipated the city's resilience or the determination of a seasoned sergeant and his loyal partner. Now, with the dawn breaking, Eric found himself standing at the edge of the city center, staring down the remnants of the building that had been their target. There was still debris scattered across the plaza, the outlines of vehicles and structures now flattened by the bomb, but there was no sign of the enemy forces. For the moment, the fight seemed to have moved elsewhere. "Sergeant," Harris said, appearing at Eric's side. The tension in his voice was gone, replaced with something softer, something more resolute. "We've got them. We've got the leader." Eric glanced over at Harris, still processing the magnitude of what had just happened. The fact that the leader of the ghost cell had been caught, taken alive, was almost too surreal to believe. But it was true. The ghost cell's reign of terror was ending, and the operation they'd been planning was falling apart. "Where is he?" Eric asked, his eyes narrowing. "Where's the mastermind behind this?" "He's being held at the temporary HQ, Harris replied. "We've got a team of interrogators working on him, but it looks like we're going to get the answers. We need fast." Eric's mind flickered back to the hours before. The fight had been brutal. The attackers had been relentless, trained to infiltrate, to blend into the environment. But they had underestimated the city's response, and they had certainly underestimated. "Max, let's go," Eric said, his voice steady. Max let out a soft bark as if he understood the gravity of the moment, and the two of them followed Harris toward the secured perimeter. The temporary HQ was a makeshift operation, set up in a large warehouse just on the outskirts of the city center. Inside, the air was tense, filled with the low murmur of voices and the soft tap of keyboards as intelligence officers worked to process the information they had gathered. At the far end of the warehouse, behind reinforced glass and under heavy guard, sat the leader of the ghost cell. Eric stood before the holding area, staring at the man behind the glass. His face was obscured by a hood, but his posture was defiant, his eyes filled with an icy contempt. He was the one responsible for the bombings, the one who had orchestrated the chaos, the one who had tried to destroy everything Eric had fought for. And now, finally, the man would answer for his actions. Max stood at Eric's side, his body tense as if sensing the danger that still lingered. Despite the man's captivity, there was no telling what his next move might be. "Are we sure he's the one?" Eric asked, his voice calm but focused. "No chance this could be a decoy or someone else trying to take credit." "He's the one," Harris replied. "We've confirmed it through multiple sources. He's been running the ghost cell operations for years, and now we have him." Eric took a deep breath. "Good, let's get some answers." The interrogation room was cold, the harsh lights casting long shadows on the walls. The leader of the ghost cell sat at the center of the room, his hands shackled to the table. Despite his captured state, he held himself with an air of authority, unyielding and unbroken. Eric walked into the room, Max at his side, his gaze never leaving the man seated before him. The leader's eyes flicked toward the dog, but there was no sign of fear. He simply regarded them both with a cool, calculating stare. "You're done," Eric said flatly, his voice sharp with finality. "This operation is over. You're not going anywhere." The man chuckled darkly. "You think this is the end? You think taking me down will stop the ghost cell? We're everywhere, Sergeant. We've been planning this for years. This city is just the beginning. There's more to come." Eric's jaw tightened. "Not if I have anything to say about it. Tell me who else is involved, who's pulling the strings behind the scenes." The man smirked, clearly enjoying the moment. "You'll never know. You're too late. It's already in motion. The real attack, the one that will bring your country to its knees. It's already happening." Eric's pulse quickened. "What do you mean? What's the next target?" The leader's smile faltered just for a moment before he spoke. "You'll see soon enough." Before Eric could press further, the door to the room slammed open and a second team of officers rushed in, their faces pale with urgency. The leader's demeanor shifted slightly, a brief flicker of alarm crossing his face. "We've got a problem," one of the officers said, breathless. "There's been an attack at the power grid. We're losing control of the city's infrastructure. It's all going dark. The ghost cell, they've activated a backup plan." Eric's heart sank. The city's entire system, its communications, its defenses, its ability to function was now compromised. The leader had been telling the truth. "No," Eric muttered, turning to Harris. "It's not over yet." Max growled low in his throat, as if sensing the danger was far from finished. "We're not done yet, are we?" Eric said, his voice steely. "The ghost cell may have made their move, but we're going to finish this. We're going to stop them once and for all." The final battle was fought in the shadows, in the quiet moments between chaos and destruction. But despite the enemy's final attempt to cripple the city's power, Eric and Max pushed forward. Working with the military and local authorities, they helped take down the rest of the ghost cell cells scattered throughout the city. The infrastructure was restored, and the people of the city, wounded and shaken, were given hope once again. In the end, the leader of the ghost cell was taken into custody, and the remaining operatives were neutralized. The city was safe for now. As Eric and Max stood at the edge of the city, watching the first rays of sunlight pierce through the dark clouds, he felt a quiet sense of closure. They had won. The battle was over, but the war, he knew, was never truly finished. And as long as there were threats like the ghost cell out there, Eric would be ready. With Max at his side, he was ready for whatever came next.